and have managed the snow wherever you are. My name is Allison Marchese. I'm the Executive Director for the Community Development Corporation of South Berkshire, and we are owners of this 100 Bridge Street project. The purpose of this meeting tonight is a continuation presenting to our status reports to the public related to the remediation and the development of our affordable housing project, Bentley Apartments, and our new riverfront park on the Housatonic at 100 Bridge Street. So the process for tonight's meeting, I just want to go over that a little bit, is going to include a PowerPoint presentation that will be brought to you by both Tim Snay, who's our licensed site professional, and Nancy Marshall, who's our project manager for Ransom Consulting LLC. Also on our panel tonight is Jim Harwood. He is president of the Community Development Corporation of South Berkshire's Board of Directors, and he has volunteered as the project manager for 100 Bridge Street. So those are our other folks that you will see on the panel. I want to make all of you aware of the fact that this presentation is being recorded and that a copy of the temporary solution statement is available, and you can find that information on the chat tonight. So following the presentation, we're going to offer an opportunity for questions, and we encourage those questions. But we would ask that you hold your questions until the end of the presentation, and you can write those into the chat, and we will be reading from there as we ask Nancy and our team to answer those questions. So just know that we will address your questions, and we're going to stay here, to try to do that. We're not in a hurry. But just remember, it's going to happen at the end. And if you have questions after tonight's meeting, you can email those questions to us because we have a 20-day public comment period. So just so you know, written questions will be answered in writing, and the questions and answers that you submit will then be, or the question and answers that we submit will be then going into our final document, which goes to the department, the DEP. I'm sure that our team will have some extra things to say about this, and so I just wanted to brief us quickly. So before we begin, I just wanted to take a moment to thank a few people, and including the town of Great Barrington, for their amazing support of this incredibly difficult, incredibly expensive, incredibly long project. And it helped us, their support helped us bring this 8.2 acre parcel back to a place that is an asset for the town. And the town has just been incredibly generous with their time and, of course, their funds. And their support has been absolutely invaluable to us, and we want to thank them. Our gratitude also goes out to Berkshire Housing Development, our partners on this project, and the management team for the apartments, the Bentley Apartments. So thank you. I also want to now acknowledge and congratulate the local teams of construction folks who are working, all of the scientists and experts, all of the town officials and the state officials, and the friends and neighbors who have supported us and who have diligently worked to help us keep this project on schedule and delivered on time despite a COVID pandemic. So I just want to thank all of them for such a hard-working group. And literally, it's taken hundreds of individuals and thousands of people hours to bring this project to a successful conclusion. And I just want to hand this off to our team tonight to talk about that. And a reminder, please add your questions at the end. So Nancy, I'm going to send this off to you to start the presentation.
Okay. All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Allison. What we've done now is we've prepared a brief presentation to walk everyone through the key points of the remediation and the development that we've completed at the site. The details are actually in the document that was submitted to DEP. So there's a draft document that is available online at the DEP website. That text is about 50 pages. And so what I'm going to do is just give you the Cliff Notes version so you have an overview of the work that we completed. If you want additional details beyond what's included in this presentation, you can ask us about those at the end. But I wanted to try to keep it straightforward during this presentation. If you have questions, please jot them down. As Allison said, we'll take those at the end. and we'll do our best to answer whatever you've asked. Another thing to just reiterate what Allison said is that the final document that we submit to DEP will include any written questions that we receive and all of our answers to those questions. So as Allison said, my name is Nancy Marshall. I'm the project manager here. I've been involved with this project since I started with Ransom in 2004. Tim Snee is the licensed site professional of the LSP for this project, and he's been involved since 2002. We know that a lot of you have been living with this site for a lot longer than that. We've been happy to see it get to this point. It's been a complicated and expensive process for the CDC. We've worked hard to get here, and we're excited to finally get to this point and to show you what we've done with the site so far. So, as most of you know, the site has an industrial history going back 100 years, but the bulk of the contamination at the site was caused by chemicals that were used by New England log homes while they were there from 1971 to really 2012. I mean, the company was operating until 1993. They were using a wood preservative that contained pentachlorophenol, or PCP, you'll hear me say, which was stored in dip tanks in three areas of the site. You know, they were, let's see, my little cursor here. Yeah, oh. Sorry, I was going to try, yeah, my cursor. So you've got dip tanks across the site, and then in this whole southern part of the site, they stored treated wood. So really the net result is that they had industrial activities across this whole property. The buildings were abandoned in 1993 when New England Log Homes stopped their operation. And then after that, the buildings were, or the main building was significantly destroyed by fire in 2001. And the contaminant at the site, which is dioxins, are formed when chlorine-containing hydrocarbons burn. So what happened when the building burned is it generated these dioxins that were contained in the soot of the buildings, and that settled on the ground across the site. So there were numerous environmental investigations that were done on this site, beginning in the 1990s. And EPA did investigations out there. Ransom has done many. There have been other consultants that have done investigations out there as well. All of those were combined to identify the contaminants at the site. And primarily what we have been dealing with are dioxins in the surface soils across the 8 acres of the site. There have been some isolated areas that have deeper impacts and other contaminants in the soil. The groundwater is primarily impacted by PCP. And the other challenge that we have at this site is that it's located within a floodplain, and because of that, there are limitations on what we could do with the redevelopment of the site. So with those challenges, the CDC's goal, and their ultimate goal here, was to restore the site for safe community use. And what they plan to do with it and what they are doing with it is for housing, which are multifamily apartments, for public open space. They're constructing a riverfront park, and then there'll be some other development in the northern portion of the site once CDC has identified a developer there. So generally, this is what the redevelopment plan looks like, and most of this has been constructed at this time. So what we see is the 3 Bentley apartment buildings on the southern end of the site. South of that, between the buildings and the wastewater treatment plant, which is located to the south, we have an engineered berm. Along the riverfront, that area has been graded, and the park is being constructed at this time. There's a stormwater basin in the southwest portion of the site, and then the northern parcel is undeveloped at this time.
Nancy, I just want to jump in for 1 sec. Those little trees that are drawn in our future, those haven't happened yet, nor has the path. I just want to mention that that's our development plan. So
yeah, that's a development plan. The site has been graded, so it's at the elevations that it's going to be, but the walkways and the trees have not been completed yet. All right, once the CDC came up with a redevelopment plan, then we were ready to come up with a remediation plan. And so because this site was rather complicated, we had a lot of meetings with DEP during this whole process to come up with something that would work for the site and would work for DEP. So we worked with that process. We ended up submitting a remediation implementation plan, or RIP, to Mass DEP in May of 2019. We went back and forth with DEP to clarify questions and address things that they had concerns about until we came to a consensus on what the best remediation strategy was for the site and the best way to sample and determine when we hit the endpoints for that remediation. And that was approved by Mass DEP in September of 2019. So once we got to that point, we could begin the remediation. And what the goal of the project was, as far as remediation, was to eliminate significant risk to the users by eliminating the exposure to the impacted soils at the site. So the way that we would do that is we would, because the contaminants, let me back up, because the contaminants were located really in the top 2 feet across the site, the idea was to relocate the top 2 feet to berms located in the south and in the eastern part of the site. We would construct an engineered barrier over those berms to create more of a permanent barrier to those soils. The development structures on the facility, like buildings and pavement, thicknesses of soil, those things would provide other caps and prevent access to soils in other areas of the site. And, you know, as much of the town, the on-site use isn't going to be, the on-site groundwater is not being used. We'll be using municipal water for the site. So under the DEP regulations, when you're remediating a site, there's really 2 outcomes. You get either a permanent solution or a temporary solution. What I'm going to do is kind of describe these definitions, and then we'll talk about what they mean. So the temporary solution or the permanent solution statement describes how the release has been cleaned up, and it documents the appropriate cleanup standards in Mass DEP regulations have been met. All right. So for a permanent solution, you need to achieve no significant risk, okay? And we'll describe what that term is, but you need to achieve no significant risk from all contaminants in soil and groundwater under the potential future exposure scenarios. So it means that even if something's not happening right now, you need to think about the fact that it could be happening in the future to get that permanent solution. Once you've submitted a permanent solution statement, no further cleanup is required by Mass DEP under the regs. And so the site is closed. For a temporary solution, you need to achieve, the term is no substantial hazard from contaminants in soil and groundwater. It looks at the current conditions and the known future conditions. So for this particular site, it would exempt, or for any site really, it exempts contaminants for which there's no exposure. So for this site, because groundwater is not used as drinking water on site, groundwater can be taken out of the risk characterization, and you can still get a temporary solution for the site without considering groundwater. Let's go to the next slide. So the risk that I talked about is no significant risk or no substantial hazard. Those are the 2 terms that DEP uses to assess whether or not a site is safe. What no significant risk means is that the site is controlled such that no contaminants will present a significant risk to health, safety, public welfare, or the environment during any foreseeable period of time. If that limitation relies on caps, as it does for this site, an activity and use limitation would be recorded with the permanent solution statement. For no substantial hazard, the site is controlled such that no contaminants will present a significant risk to health, safety, public welfare, or the environment if present for several years. If the limitation of an exposure relies on caps, the conditions can be used with a temporary solution instead of submitting an activity and use limitation. And those conditions that are established in the temporary solution statement are verified in regular status reports that are submitted to DEP. So saying those words, what does it actually mean at the site? Because that's really what we want to know. What does it mean? What it means is that the site is safe for public use with either a temporary or a permanent solution. Both types for this site are going to rely on barriers to the soil because contaminated soil is still on site, and everybody knew that going in. So we've got soil on the site with no access to it. The Bentley temporary solution we think the Bentley temporary solution may be converted into a permanent solution. And we think that can happen really in the next few years. The difference again is that the permanent solution has to consider groundwater. And we have portions of the site where the groundwater will meet the drinking water standards. And the Bentley parcel is one of those areas of the site. So what will happen is we will do some future groundwater monitoring after this temporary solution is submitted. And once those groundwater results show that we've met drinking water standards, we can submit a permanent solution for this portion of the site. So I want to tell you what we've done for the completed remediation out there. We began remediation in October of 2019, and this is what we've done. The top 2 feet of the soil were removed from across the entire site, and that soil was moved in to create the southern and the eastern berms. Each excavation area was sized so we could complete the 2 feet of excavation within approximately 1 day. And that way we could control the amount of excavation that was going on at the site. In all, we ended up with about 30 different separate excavation units. After the excavation depth was reached in each unit, we collected composite samples of the surface soils. So we wanted to make sure that we had taken off the contaminated soils that were on top. So once we got to the excavation level, we collected samples, we sent them off for analysis. DEP approved the method that we had agreed to for that sampling. So we had the right number of samples to represent what was actually at the site. When the data came back, if the soil concentrations were above what we were targeting, then we went back in and we excavated additional soil in that area, and then we repeated the sampling process until we got to the point where we knew that our remediation targets were reached. So at this point, the soil remediation is complete on the parcels occupied by the southern berm, the riverfront area, Bentley apartments, and on land located within 50 feet of the Bentley apartments. That was part of the agreement with the town, was that the remediation would be complete within all of those parcels with this development, before any occupancy happened. So with all of that, all of the work completed to date, there's no potential for exposure to contaminants in soil with this current development. So this is a picture of what the site looks like. Sorry. This is a picture of what the site looks like right now. You'll see the red line that goes around the site is the partial site boundary, or what we're calling a portion of the site to which the temporary solution statement applies. Lot 3 is the Bentley apartment parcel, and the lot line is here. This is 50 feet from that lot line. The southern berm is down here. The southwest detention basin is here. And then this area along the riverfront is where the future park is going to be. This area is reserved for future development, whatever that's going to be. And then there's the start of the eastern berm. And probably most of the eastern berm is in place over here. So as I mentioned, the engineered barrier has been constructed on the southern berm. That's where the majority of the soil excavated from across the site has been moved. The cross-section of the engineered barrier was approved by DEP before we even started the construction, and it contains the elements that will ensure that the soil remains covered as long as the site is in use. So on top of the soil, we have a geogrid and a geotextile, and it's a plastic grid, a thicker grid that's going to prevent burrowing animals or anything like that. On top of that, there's a demarcation barrier, so if anything got exposed down to that point, it would be obvious and you would see it. There's a minimum of a foot of clean loam and topsoil over the top of that, and then there's vegetation. We put split rail fencing across the bottom of this to discourage use of the berm. It's not that the berm could not be walked on, but the more that it is left alone, the less maintenance it's going to need. And so we're discouraging use of the berms. And so the big question is really, how do we know this is safe? How do you know the site's safe? Because that's what really everyone wants to know. And that's what the DEP regulations and the cleanup requirements are all about. So the way that DEP determines that a site is safe is they used a risk-based approach to determine if the site's safe for the intended use, okay? And so the amount of risk that a site poses depends on the receptors or the users, the exposure pathways, and the types of contaminant. So for this site, we've got multiple uses out there. We needed to consider multiple receptors. We have residents on the Bentley Apartments. We have park visitors on the riverfront. We've got construction workers for the northern parcel. And then if people go where they're not supposed to go, behind fences that have been put up to keep them out, we have trespassers, and we've considered the risk to potential trespassers as well. The possible exposure pathway talks about how could a person come in contact with the chemicals that are there. And really for this site, it's dermal contact, which means, touching the skin. So we've looked at that even though we've prevented exposure to the soils that are out there. The contaminant levels, the how much part, is based on all of that post-excavation sampling that we did. So we have a good handle on what concentrations remain out there, and we could put those into the risk characterization forms as well. So what DEP did to make sure that everybody is using a consistent method and to make it easier for their review, they have developed spreadsheets called short forms. And these short forms are based on particular exposure scenarios. And within each of those scenarios, DEP has used very conservative assumptions. They put in the exposure assumptions and the toxicity information for the contaminants. Once you have that information, you put in the specific concentrations that you've determined are present at the site, and the short forms will calculate the risk for these standard scenarios in terms of both cancer and non-cancer risks. So we've looked at 4 different areas. So we've used 4 different types of short forms to assess the risks on different areas of the site. For the Bentley Apartments, obviously we looked at the residential risk, which is really the most stringent. And for this area, because of the site grading that they use, there's up to 7 feet of clean soil fill over the existing soils. Even with that, there are a few areas where there's 3 feet of soil fill. We considered anything that was within that range, and we looked at the risks there. And the bottom line is that the soils meet the criteria for residential use with the current site development on the Bentley parcel. For the riverfront park, again, this is the final plan. The risk is based on what's there right now, and the risk will go down as they add features to this area. But with this, there's 8 inches of topsoil over the existing site soils, and with what's there right now, the soils meet the criteria for park use with the current development. The next part of the site is the Southwest Stormwater Basin. Because this area is designed to contain water with the stormwater, stormwater will pond in this area. There will be a fence around this area, so this area isn't really open to the public. But we have assessed this area anyway, and the soils in that area meet the criteria for use by a construction worker and by a trespasser. The last portion of the site is the northern parcel. Again, until the development is complete on this site, this area is fenced to prevent public access. The top 2 feet of soil has been stripped in this area and moved to the berm area. And the soils that are remaining at the site have been covered with a stabilization agent to prevent dust and erosion and those kinds of things. But this area this area will, the final remediation of this area will include some of the caps and things that are part of the final development plan. So this area is pending final development, but it is safe for use by a construction worker or a trespasser as it is right now. So the conclusions that we have out there really is that no significant risks exist for the accessible soils in the Bentley Apartments parcel and along the riverfront. No substantial hazard exists for the remaining soils at the site. So these are the deeper ones that are underneath caps and soils that are protected by the engineered barrier and the berms, and soils that are behind the fencing. So those all have no substantial hazard on them. No substantial hazard exists for the groundwater at the site, as the groundwater is not in use. And, importantly, the historical sampling has not shown any adverse impacts to the river from the groundwater contamination at the site. And when the sampling indicates that the groundwater beneath the portion of the site meets the groundwater standards, like as I talked about with the Bentley parcel, that temporary solution that we have right now can be converted into a permanent solution. When we do that, an activity and use limitation would be submitted with the permanent solution to memorialize the conditions that are included in the temporary solution statement right now. So as far as upcoming activities, the CDC is working on identifying a future developer. The remediation of the northern parcel will be completed prior to the final development of that portion of the site. The temporary solution requires that there are semi-annual inspections to confirm that the cap is being maintained and the engineered barrier is being maintained. And those, maintenance will be performed if those needs are identified. The last thing is that monitoring wells will be installed and groundwater will be sampled periodically to assess the progress towards a permanent solution. So as I noted in the beginning, we've prepared a draft temporary solution statement for this portion of the site. And by doing it for a portion of the overall disposal site, it becomes a partial temporary solution statement. That document is available on the Mass DEP website. You can go into Mass DEP and look and type in find out about a contaminated property, or you can go straight to this link that I've provided you right there. The release tracking number for the site is provided there. It's 1-682, and you need to put in 7 digits or it will tell you it can't find the site. Once you get in there, you look at supporting documents, electronically submitted files, and you'll see that there's a draft partial temporary solution statement with conditions that was submitted on January 28th. So that's the document, and then the bottom link is a direct link to that document. Contact information, there we go. Okay, so at this point, we'll open things up to question. Tim Snee, the LSP, or I will do the best we can to answer questions. And again, we encourage you to submit them in writing to the CDC during the public comment period. And, questions that come in writing will be answered in writing and included in that final document. Allison's information is there, and you can submit those questions to Allison. And I will. Oh,
I'm just looking at the questions, Nancy. Thank you for that. And I think that I'm looking at the questions. Okay, one question is: will this presentation be recorded, and will it be available? Yes, it will be. We're working on how to do that right now. I hope to have a better answer for you in a few minutes. And then a question came, can you describe the eastern berm and its status? So can you review that one more time?
Yep.
Nancy?
Yep. So the material from mostly the northern portion of the site was relocated from that northern portion to the eastern berm. At this point, there's not an engineered barrier over it because there may be some additional soil that ends up being moved there during the final development phase of the northern parcel. So at this point, we had talked to DEP about what they required to stabilize that area, and we knew we used a product unfortunately named Gorilla Snot. It's a soil stabilizer, and it prevents erosion and dust, and just basically glues everything in place. So that's placed over the berm, and it's also placed over the whole of the northern parcel that's not yet developed.
And there'll be an obligation for CDC to periodically make sure that the eastern berm and the northern parcel remain stable, so there isn't a risk of wind or water erosion from those areas as they evaluate options for redevelopment.
Okay, so I'm getting a bunch of questions. Just bear with me here. So the one question came in about groundwater. Well, we had talked about groundwater being cleaner. So the question is, will the groundwater be cleaner over time than it is now? And how does that happen?
I'll take a stab at that. So the issue that we're faced with at this site is that the site is located within the geographical boundaries of the Sheffield Wellfield Zone 2. So meaning that the groundwater from within that Zone 2 contributes to the wellhead in Sheffield as a public water supply. So we are obliged to achieve the drinking water standard for pentachlorophenol, which is 1 part per billion. So we recognize that in the sort of northern portion of the parcel, sort of trending westerly towards the Housatonic, there are elevated concentrations of PCP in groundwater that are above that 1 part per billion limit. In areas outside of that plume, particularly under the Bentley Apartments, the last sampling we did, we found that we had 1.1 part per billion of PCP in groundwater. So portions of the Bentley apartment are kind of cross gradient to how we've delineated this PCP plume in groundwater. So ideally, with time and dilution and the removal of ongoing sources of PCP to groundwater will eventually sort of clean itself up over time through basically dilution advection. So that portion of the site, we think we're going to get groundwater levels below that criteria. The other portions of the site where they're more elevated, we haven't really found a mechanism or treatment technology that can remediate PCP in groundwater in place. So part of our obligation is when we file a temporary solution statement that every 5 years we're obliged to submit to DEP a temporary solutions evaluation whereby we look at have technologies changed that would allow us to treat groundwater in place for PCP, or has the site with time basically gradually cleaned itself up through dilution and no longer being sources of PCP in groundwater. So we've got to monitor it as we go forward, but there haven't been any technologies right now that we've identified that can effectively remediate PCP in groundwater.
So let me add to that a little bit too, even though that was, sorry. I wanted to give you a little here. Yeah, here we go. So where the bulk of the groundwater plume is in this area right here. And if you remember the first site plan that I showed you that had the old warehouse building, there was a dip tank right around here. That's the bulk of it. When we last did our groundwater sampling in 2019, we had one well that was right around here on the site. The PCP concentration in that well was 1.1 micrograms per liter. And as Tim said, the limit that we're trying to get to is 1. So it's really close. The plan that we have in the temporary solution statement includes putting in a ground monitoring well like right here on the Bentley parcel, down here, which is kind of down gradient from the bulk of the plume, and then another one down here. Once those wells, these particular wells here, outside of the main direction of the plume, get to 1, we'll be able to complete that permanent solution. Sorry.
That's okay. I'm just going to answer one question. People, and Nancy, could you please leave the map up? That was one request.
That's what I was trying to do.
Okay. Asked us to show who's in the room, so we're working on trying to hit the right button here to show everyone who's present. Just know that we're trying to make that happen for you. And so let's see. The other question is why about registration for this meeting. I just want to make a quick point that during COVID, the DEP public meeting parameters allowed, suggested actually, that we use a more protected way of getting people into a room. There's ways in which people have been hacking into Zoom meetings, so therefore this registration process has been available to us. I want to go back to the questions, and I hope that we answered that one. Okay, so what is the landscaping plan for along the edge of the property, along Bridge Street, most impactful, highest traffic area? What is the plantings on, what are the plantings on the berms? And may I suggest wildflower meadow mix to support pollinators and stabilize erosion? Who wants to take that one?
We can talk to the berms. That's something that we sort of talked about, was having that kind of wildflower vegetation mix for the berms, as stabilizing them and making them, aesthetically pleasing and attracting, being consistent with local flora and fauna. The other landscaping we can't really talk to. That's sort of outside of our purview at the moment.
Right, and it's outside of.
Go ahead, Nancy.
Right. Well, I was just going to say the future development scheme for the Bentley, for the northern parcel there, hasn't been identified yet. So that landscaping will come in with that development. As Tim said, we're talking about stuff for the berms that will make it aesthetically pleasing and also discard, not make it look like a great place to play King of the Hill for a bunch of kids. So it's not going to be, we're not planning on having it be this nice grassy hill that the kids are going to be drawn to. More of a wildflower and a mix that's going to discourage kids from using it.
And
I want to just move on to the next question.
Well, it was asking about the whole site. So portions of the site are governed by Conservation Commission, and the plantings along there are heavily prescribed as native plantings, and we're working with a specialist on that.
Okay. So the question, this is kind of combined, two people asked the same question. How far did the dioxins travel from the source of contamination? The other way one of the people asked was, how far from the center of the pollution was the soil removed? So I gather this is a question of how far they traveled.
From the center of pollution. I'm not quite sure I understand
how
that,
far did the dioxins travel from the source of the contamination, I suppose?
Right. So the source, because of, again, the fire at this site, the model that we have for the contaminants at this site, primarily for the dioxins, is that soot from the fire settled across the site. And the areas of the site, like here's the chimney. So there may have been some things going on from the chimney before the fire. And then the heaviest area that we have for the contamination was up in this northern area. Really right in around, here was the old building was in through here, and it's like the soot that settled immediately around the building from the fire. But we had stuff, we had stuff that spread at lesser concentrations across the site. Once dioxins get in soil, they've been deposited atmospherically from the soot is the model that we have. Once they're in soil, they don't tend to travel. So when we did our initial sampling, this stuff was really within the top 6 inches. When we attempted to do the bioremediation out there, we tilled the top 2 feet, which meant that we were expecting that whatever was in the top 6 inches might have gotten mixed into the top 2 feet. So the top 2 feet is what we stripped from the entire site. So I hope that answers it. Tim, you can add.
Yeah, and I think we tried to present in the 2019 public meeting and also in our phase 4 RIP, the notion that, the dioxins and furans, as they're based on their chemical nature, they're very, very insoluble in water. They have a high propensity to adsorb to organic carbon in the environment. So their mobility is pretty limited to where they land. And also based on their chemical composition, they're not volatile, so they aren't going to vaporize like some other contaminants like, benzenes and toluenes will vaporize into the air. So these, unfortunately are very, very stable chemicals. That's why they're still in place. They don't break down very easily, and they don't move very much. So the model we used was that once they hit the ground, they sort of stuck there and they moved with the soil. And they didn't necessarily migrate significantly with, ground with rainwater infiltrating through the soil and mobilizing the dioxins and furan. So they're very recalcitrant, very immobile in the environment. So that's sort of how we've managed them on site.
Yeah, and let me just add one more thing. To back that up, we did a lot of soil sampling out here, and a lot of the borings we took samples at 2 foot intervals, 2 foot depth intervals, and we were sampling. If we had hits of dioxin in one sample, then we would analyze the sample below that. And really, what we found out was across most of this site, it was limited to the top 2 feet, except for a couple of isolated areas, and those again were areas near the dip tank. So we know that they were not migrating vertically.
So I'm getting a bunch of questions about the landscaping, and especially from one person saying, in the meantime, waiting for future tenant, can the area along Bridge Street and Bentley be cleaned up and maintained in a way that is respectful to the town and the neighbors? And the short answer to that is, of course. And we're just starting to do some work there because of it's winter. It's a little tough, but we will make that more presentable. And obviously, we all want that to look as best as possible. So I hope that answers your question. Another question. Also, where is the mixed mature tree screening? I believe maybe perhaps in the past meeting, this was mentioned, delineating between residential buildings and the treatment plant. But that is how the berm got there. Do you guys want to address that? But there, I think in one of the earlier plans, maybe there was tree plantings, but then the berm was moved. Is that correct?
The berm was moved. So I'm not, we can't plant trees on the berm. We're not doing that. We are planting trees along the riverfront, but there won't be any trees on the berm.
And
So,
the berm was moved south of the buildings at the request of the town, the ZBA. So that plan change, I think, eliminated those trees.
Okay, I hope that does that. And I have another question. How far apart were the samples from each other?
Oh boy. All right, you gotta sit down for this. I think you have to get comfortable.
Okay, that's okay. No, so we used a pretty elaborate technique. It's called an incremental sampling method, and we went back and forth with DEP about the best way to do this because we wanted to make sure that the samples were representative of everything across the site. So, as I said before, we had 30 different individual sampling units. There were, maybe like 100 by 100 squares, say. And what we did is within that area, which was kind of the daily excavation area, we set a grid that was a 10 foot by 10 foot grid. So for 100 by 100 area, we had a 10 foot by 10 foot grid laid out in there, and there would be 81 sampling nodes in that area. And so what we would do is we would take a small piece of that soil from each of those 81 nodes, combine it, and then we sent it to a particular lab called Test America, who does incremental composite sampling processing. And they homogenize that soil so it becomes a solid cake, and it's all milled and ground, so everything is mixed together. So if you take any piece of that sampling cake, it is representative of the whole thing. Unlike if you just do a straight composite sample, you can take a piece off of here and a piece off of there, and you may get different concentrations. So by doing this incremental composite sampling method, we were able to collect these samples across the whole area, and then and have that one concentration be representative of that 100 by 100 foot area. So again, we had about 30 of those separate areas. In 7 of those areas, when we got the samples back, if it was higher than what we wanted it to be, we excavated out that whole 100 by 100 area, and another foot of that 100 by 100 area, and resampled the whole thing again using that same procedure. So really, if you think about a composite sample and the way that we did it, we sampled that entire 8-acre property. And DEP was on board with the process. And also just, as we were coming up with this method, I found some EPA paperwork on incremental composite sampling for dioxins, and we use that as our methodology.
Right. And the intent behind that is to be able to get a soil sample, soil data that most accurately reflects the potential for exposure at a portion of the site that's at 100 foot by 100 foot area. Rather than relying on a single point sample taken from a 100 foot by 100 foot area, our sampling represents that entire area.
Yep.
So we have a lot of questions. I want to try to get to them. There's a question about the black fencing. Will that be remaining? And is there a play area for children? And how are we going to keep those children off the berms? That came up a couple times.
So there's different areas of black fencing, and right now there's black fencing around what we're calling the northern parcel, which is waiting for a final development. That fence will remain in place until that portion of the site is developed. But once that portion of the site is developed, we anticipate that fence will come down. And then there's some fencing around a stormwater basin in the southwest corner of the site. And that fencing will remain in place indefinitely.
Thank you, Jim. I also want to mention that if you see us all looking around at things, it's because we're reading questions. So we're not looking directly at the screen. I just want you to know that we're paying attention and we're listening.
And also some of the questions are being posted in the chat, and some of them are being posted in the questions. It would be helpful if they were all posted.
Yeah, I think most everybody is over to the chat right now. So if just a reminder, please put your questions in the chat. I'll do my best to read everything. A question came up about groundwater at 100 Bridge. Isn't it crucial to Sheffield's water supply? If that is so, why wouldn't the quality and safety of the groundwater taken more seriously in this plan? So I think that we could address it from the point of view of how we've been required to deal with that.
Tim, do you want?
Yeah, we are taking it seriously. The challenge, there's 2 things we're trying to accommodate. One is, the notion of a temporary solution so that we can, get the property back into use. And then the longer term issue is, managing the PCP contaminated groundwater at the site. So, right now, there's nothing that we've been able to identify that's a cost effective way of treating it in place. And we haven't gone through a long process to delineate, the likely contribution of groundwater from this site to the Sheffield wellfield. I know that the Sheffield wellfield is on the other side of the Housatonic and at some distance from the site, but we haven't, gone through the modeling effort to sort of estimate, what is the opportunity or chance of PCP and groundwater getting to the Sheffield well site. I can't answer that because we just don't have an answer for how we can remediate that on site.
What we have done a few times, though, is we've sampled the water in the Housatonic right at the edge of the site, and we're not picking up any PCBs there. So PCPs. So whatever is in the groundwater in the site is not adversely impacting the river.
And to restate what Tim said earlier, at the moment, there is no technology available, and every 5 years, they'll reevaluate that.
Right.
I also want to address the question that came up about the nature of this meeting tonight. This is a status report of continuing work and milestones. There's nothing new to report. There's no new information. I think there might have been some various emails today about the content of this report tonight, but there's no new findings. There is nothing new to report. We're bringing you our updates and the continuing process, and that's what we're here for tonight. So I hope that answers that question. And the question, its next question was, will you be monitoring the occupants of this location for signs of contaminant poisoning? I don't believe that's in our scope of.
Well, yeah, our approach was to, that's the reason we put these, these contaminated soils beneath these berms under these engineered barriers, was to prevent exposure. And given, the thickness of some of the fill that was brought in, the presence of the buildings themselves, the pavement sections, the chemical nature of the dioxins and furans not being a volatile contaminant, there's no reason to suspect that there'd be any route of exposure to future occupants. That was our number one objective, was to prevent exposure to these contaminated soils.
Right.
So,
and it meets all of DEP's risk criteria for residents.
So the next question we have is, would it be possible to discuss acquiring the front parcel by the town of GB for a park, for a very nicely landscaped parking area, or to support Riverwalk or the co-op downtown, et cetera? And I can address this question. That would be a terrific idea. We've thought about it, and I don't think the town of Great Barrington is looking to acquire the park or the parcel that is up for development. We are creating a park on the riverfront, which they have wonderfully supported already. So I think that they're doing their part as far as creating park space. We are actively looking for a partner, for the development partner, for a developer there. So we'll do our best to keep you updated on that. So as soon as possible, we'll do that.
I add something?
Sure.
And if there's a serious plan for that, you know how to get in touch with us through our email, and we'd be happy to talk to you about it. We're in a process of looking at options for that site, and we feel strongly that the options need to be synergistic with the riverfront park and the residential development, and should benefit the town and the economy of Great Barrington. So those are our goals. If you want to help us achieve that, we're happy to talk to you.
Yes, and we're very cognizant of the fact that we're in a residential area. So speaking of that, someone asked the question, what is the projected occupancy date for the apartments? And having met a couple times this week with the folks at Berkshire Housing, we're looking, currently they're taking applications on their website. If anyone's interested, they can go to Berkshire Housing Development for the application. And we're looking at a occupancy around May. So that's the projection. Let's see. So why not test over time for contaminants, poisoning? That's the continuation of that question earlier.
I think they mean people.
I would assume that, but I don't think that, I know.
I mean, I think the key thing is, without exposure, there isn't necessarily risk. So what I'm struggling with a little bit with the question is that, given the efforts that the CDC's gone through as far as installing the berms, installing the pavement sections and buildings, and affecting the grades with clean fill, there's not really a current exposure pathway that we could say is likely there. So the question is, if there's no exposure, how would there be a risk? And therefore, why would there be a reason to monitor folks for that risk if there isn't a way of exposure to occur?
And the ongoing obligation really is about maintaining the barriers over time, right? So that it's keeping that risk from popping back up.
Right. And that actually is a great segue to the next question. Is there a plan to monitor the structural integrity of the berms after a major flood event, say, given that while they given that while they are capped, they are not lined. So that might be something we want to revisit.
I think one thing that's important to note is that as part of installing these engineered barriers, the CDC was obliged to put in place a financial aid mechanism that is basically a bond or insurance policy that provides funding in the event that there was a catastrophic failure of a berm due to some activity. So that would allow for repair, restoration of those berms in a timely fashion. But we're not clear that if it was inundated, that would cause those berms to fail. Inundation is not the same as being in the river and having currents rip through it. If it's simply inundated, we don't see there being an issue with respect to the berms themselves. The bigger issue would be to the residents living there.
Jim, you had said earlier something to the effect about no technology, and it's been asked to give a little more information. You said,
we can't remediate the groundwater because there's no technology that exists to remediate the groundwater, and we'll reevaluate that every 5 years.
Okay. How often will you be monitoring the northern part of the parcel and eastern berm for potential health risks to the surrounding community?
Well, as part of the temporary solution, there's an obligation to do regular inspections of that portion of the site and then provide semi-annual reports to DEP confirming the condition of the stabilized northern lot and also the condition of the eastern berm until such time as that portion of the site has been redeveloped. So there'll be eyes on it for this time going forward until it's been redeveloped completely.
So there's a follow-up question about the berm. I believe the one person who asked about the flood or any kind of substantial flood, about contamination flowing into the river after any major flood. Are we seeing anything like that? Or do we anticipate anything, and how would we handle that?
Well, the way I look at it now is before the berms were there, the most contaminated soils were at the ground surface. So, in the case of a flood, with all stuff being at the ground surface, there will be much more risk of those soils making their way into the Housatonic under that flooding condition than there would be now, given they're under berms covered with topsoil and have this geogrid and geofabric stabilizing it, holding it in place. So basically, we basically have wrapped around the toe of the fabric and geogrid under soil so that it serves as kind of an anchor to keep the berm in place. So it's far more stable in its current layout than it would be if there were no berms under flooding conditions. So right now we've mitigated really the risk of flooding impacts to the Housatonic from contaminants at the site because they're now under the berms versus being at surface grade where they'd be easily flushed into the river.
So another question, I hope that all of you are patient with me because there's one of me and there's many questions. Know that I'm paying attention and I will get there. So what type of development is being looked at for the remainder of the site? So I imagine that's the northern portion. And will this be cleaned up if no developer steps forward? And what is the contingency plan if no developer is found? So I can begin by saying that we are actively looking for an appropriate development there. Obviously, we have to think about what it's zoned for, what's appropriate for the neighborhood. I think one of our very first choices would be potentially additional housing, and that might be something that we can work with. There's a lot of ideas on the table right now, but nothing solid that we can come to you and say this is what we've got. But we're working diligently to do that. So, and there's no option. Hello?
Yeah.
I can still see you.
I have lost my screen completely.
Okay, we can still hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just cut out completely for some reason. But there's no option for us not to develop that property. That is our obligation. So, Jim, maybe you want to jump in there while I figure out why my screen has gone blank.
Okay. Well, I would just reiterate what Allison said, which is that we view it as a responsibility to the community. And the longer it sits undeveloped, there's an opportunity cost that's lost in that. And we have a maintenance cost in taking care of that property. So it's incumbent on us to develop it as soon as practical. We've had some close calls, let's call it, with assisted living, 2 different developers, but those didn't materialize, and there are ways in which COVID has changed people's view of the world that have maybe helped create some opportunities for development on the site, but it's certainly shaken things up. So what looked like a good idea 2 years ago maybe doesn't look like a good idea now. So we're working with it. We have a zoning study. We're working with a civil engineer to quantify the restrictions based on the floodplain, and we are actively, we have a group of people pursuing a housing option, and then we have a group of people pursuing a more open-ended option for the site. I think if we were to go down the road of housing, it would likely be 2 to 4 years before something materialized in that, and has a lot to do with the funding table for DHCD. I can't speak to the other options because they're much more hypothetical.
So I'm having a little screen problem. So maybe Jim, if you can
Sure.
repeat the questions, can you kind of fill in there?
Yeah, maybe you could speak to the timetable on the approach to the development of the park.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to do that. So the development of the park is we're working with our contact, Emily Stockman, who is been our DEP contact as far as how we work through the water restrictions and of course the conservation restrictions that we're passing that. It's all working well. It's just a matter of getting Emily there. We'll be approaching the planting season soon, so Emily will be working on the native plants that will go along the conservation restricted area, which is on the edge of the Housatonic, on the edge of the park. So that will come up as soon as we can have a clear shot at the planting season, which may be, who knows, perhaps April, May. So we're working toward that. And then we have our board member, Craig Okerstrom Lang, who has been helping us to volunteer and design the park pathways. So we have that working toward it. And we have been actively fundraising for the park. So all those pieces are in motion, and we'll have an update as soon as we have an update. So clearly we'll be making some progress in the spring.
Okay. There were a couple questions about children playing and the berms, and one of the questions it said the flower beds. So I think the flower beds probably meant the berms. And there's 2 different berms. There's the eastern berm, which is part of the northern undeveloped section of the site and is not accessible and can't be accessed until we complete the development and remediation and development there. And the southern berm is completed, and it is separated by a split rail fence. And Tim, correct me if I'm wrong here, it's safe for people to be on that berm, but we're discouraging it to minimize maintenance. And if people want to play outside, we have a riverfront park for them, 2 acres. There's a question, would I drink the water from this site if I lived there? I think it would be important to reiterate that no one that's living on this site will be drinking the groundwater. It gets water from the town water supply, so no one will have to drink the water from this site. What kind of fencing are we talking about? There's 2 different kinds of fencing where we're prohibiting access. It's a chain link fence, approximately 6 feet high, and where we're discouraging access, it's a split rail fence, which would probably be about 3 feet high, but you could go over it or under it if you desired. There was a question from Heather. Said someone sent out an email today that a contaminant.
We addressed that one. about the misinformation about the nature of the meeting.
Yeah.
That there was some new information that we were presenting tonight, but there is no.
There's
This
no
is a continuation of the plan, and we've presented several times. It's probably rather redundant, but there's no new findings. There's no new information.
right. There are 2 contaminants on the site. We've been working to remediate those. Let's see.
Jim, do you see Lee's question about the type of development on the remainder of the site?
Yeah, I thought we just answered that.
I think we answered that one.
Okay.
How much money was put aside for the contingency damages? The financial assurance mechanism is a $250,000. The word's escaping me, but
Trust.
It's cash in the bank.
It's called a trust.
Okay.
So that is money that will be used for that purpose only.
And we are obliged to do that by regulation because we have these engineered barriers, and it raises a level of maintenance and protections for these things. So the CDC had to come up with that trust in order for this process to move forward.
Right, and I know that the CDC worked with DEP to figure out what elements had to be included in that, and DEP had agreed on the dollar amount.
And so there's a recurring question about the drinking water. People are not allowed to drink the water on the site, and if that changes, if testing shows that changes, then people could be allowed to drink the water on the site. So right now there is no confidence that the water on the site should be drunk. Right? Dennis, I hope that answers your question. And unless there's more questions, I think we're at the end of the list.
Okay. I want to reiterate that we do encourage and urge you to send your questions to us at the CDC. Emmeline will put the email back up there if it's not already in the chat, but it's just simply info@cdcsb.org, and we encourage you to send your questions, and we will answer them in writing, and then they will be filed in our final report, and there's a 20-day public comment. So I want to say, please do that. If you should have any other questions, please call us tomorrow, and we will try to follow up all of those other questions about tonight's meeting. But I want to thank everyone for being here, and I appreciate your questions and your time, and so thank you. And unless we have something else, we're good?
Yep.
Okay, well, I think we can close.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.